about. I'm going to start off the evening by just looking a little bit in brief detail about the Harvest Mouse survey itself and how you actually decide where the sites are and things along those sorts of lines. So I'll just share my screen and start off my presentation. Dun, 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 if we can just get it to go to that. So as was said, I'm Derek Crawley. I'm the Vice Chair of the Mammal Society. I sit on the committee that actually runs the Harvest Mouse survey. We are in our 4th year, and it's just a case of trying to sort of reset that scene to say why we actually did this and moved on. And it's basically about the estimated decline of the species and the number of records that was missing across the aspect. We looked at this both in the Atlas of British Mammals, but also under the Population Review and the State of British Mammals way back in 2018. And we highlighted that the Harvest mouse was a species that was under-recorded or misleading in its evidence, and we wanted to try and find out what was happening within that one. So, and generally there was this reduction within the 10-kilometre hectads that went with it from there. And you can see this general decline that was going on, which is why it sort of brought us forward from that one. Now, the Harvest mouse itself is a very small, it's one of our smallest British mammals. There's arguments over whether it's this or the pygmy shrew. And it has this unique ability to actually have a prehensile tail, so it can actually use its tail as a fifth limb to actually grab onto different stalks as it moves through the arboreal grasses, if you like. It tends to go through at height within the grasses, and it actually makes its nest at that height as well, and makes life slightly easier. Now, there are loads and loads of different ways of actually recording them. You might actually be lucky enough to see them. I've only seen about 2 or 3 in the wild, and most of those, I have to admit, have come through Longworth traps, but I have seen 1 or 2 just running around the place. As you heard before, we were talking about owl pellets, looking for greater white-toothed shrews. You can sometimes find harvest mice skulls in there as well, but because they're so small, the skull is very delicate, and quite often you might only just find basically the bottom jaw. But it has got a certain number of root canals, which makes it very easy to distinguish. Occasionally, you might find some dead ones. Normally, if you've got cats, your cat might bring one in, and it goes from there. There are bait tubes that can be used and footprint tunnels, and with that little bit of mesh around it, that's actually just allows the Harvest mouse and pygmy shrews to get through. The mesh size is about 13 mil, and it goes on from there. You can get some acoustics on them, although they don't make that many noises in between. But if 2 animals do come together, then they can sometimes emit ultrasonic sounds, which you can pick up on the new methodologies of things like audio moth and everything else there. Camera traps do work occasionally, but we don't hit them that often with harvest mice. It tends to be other species first. And there's thermal, which supposedly the nests are a little bit warmer. There's R detection dogs, as you can see there, although these haven't been used that effectively. And then you actually get the use of actually finding these breeding nests, which are only used once in the season, and they then put another nest in. They can breed 3 or 4 times in the year, sometimes 6. And because these are left in situ and the nests are actually attached to the stalks, they don't fall out as quickly as birds' nests, and therefore they have longevity in that grassland. And that's what we're hunting for within most of our surveys, because it's an easy way of doing it. And once you get your eye in, you can actually find these nests quite easily, or they do tend to be the same coloration as the vegetation, which makes it that little bit harder to do. This is an idea of that prehensile tile, and it starts to show some of the problems of where the harvest mouse is likely to go in vegetation, because if it's going to have to reach between one stem and another, although it can use its tail as a counterbalance, it then is a case of reaching across to where that next leaf is to pull that together to actually make their nests. And here you can see an example of how it actually does that. So it sits on one particular stalk, reaches across to another stalk and grabs a leaf, and then it actually shreds that leaf into strips, and those strips are then used to actually weave the nest together. Okay, and it ends up, depending on the vegetation, about 3/4 of the height, half to 3/4 of the height of that vegetation, up into that area where the nest is actually created. And that's what you're looking for. Typical breeding nest, you can see 6 to 10 centimeters in diameter, so it's about the size of a tennis ball. Smaller individual nests are more like the size of a golf ball. And this is the problem they have. We have these nice pictures of them sitting in cornfields, in agricultural fields, but because of the way that these are now drilled these days, the habitat's not right for them. The stalks are really too far apart, and the harvest mice doesn't actually use them very often. So they tend to use the more wild vegetations to go with it, but it's trying to get those that have got structure so the animal can actually come up above the ground in order to actually make its nests. So quite often when you're looking at the vegetation, you need to be able to look through it and work out how close together those stems are. And you can see in this picture of Phragmites, I can see all the way through it. There isn't many leaf stalks at this height. You're not going to find a harvest mouse nest in that lot. If it was there, it would stick out like a sore thumb, but they generally don't use this at the moment. They'll wait until maybe this gets flattened and then the leaves and the stems are closer together, and we tend to find more nests at that situation than as this with all those holes in between. When we look at the different habitats that you might find them in, this is some of the information that we've had previous to other surveys that we've carried out, and you can see that when you look at the presence, absence, and the number of surveys done in different areas, this is where we get an idea of where you can look in the future. So although we're halfway through the season at the moment, these are the kinds of areas that you might want to go down to try and find harvest mice. So you can see within these ones, the ones that are best tends to be the field margins with the rough grass down the side, although the wetland areas and reed bed marsh do quite well as well, with 30 presences there. But and probably more presence there than anything else when you look against the number of surveys. But again, other areas don't quite do quite so well. So just a field on its own doesn't really work. So it's trying to find that right type of vegetation that goes with it. Now, although this field of a hay meadow looks quite good, it's not, because most of the actual leaf level at this one is quite low down, and you're not going to find any harvest mice at this point. Here we're actually looking for field voles, but as you go down towards the back of the picture and the grasses are taller, especially down on the edge of the reservoir there, you can see some reed-like grasses. That's more the area that you want to look at, because the arboreal leaves are really quite close together, and that's the preferred habitat that they have. Again, in this picture, in the foreground and right at the very back, you've got more of these tall grasses where the leaves are quite tall. The seed heads on top of these aren't really used. That's just a method of getting those seeds higher up. So they're not going to nest at those levels, but lower down where you've got all that leaf matter you'll actually find. So the two gentlemen are actually looking for harvest mice, and the lady just on the back there is still looking for field voles. But if they then all move back towards that wetland area, again, you're going to swap over looking at both. Both will be in the area, but as soon as you hit that stalk level, then you're looking towards harvest mice. So again, if the vegetation has grown up through bramble, it actually supports that vegetation slightly better, and therefore this could be a quite good area to look. And sometimes we find good signs within this, because the grasses just push up through the bramble and help support it. The same works on a hedgerow or a field boundary, a fence boundary, where the grasses are actually held up by that boundary and therefore provide a suitable place for a nest. And on this one, you can see there are two nests that were just in amongst that bramble there, having been cut and became really quite exposed and easy to find. So again, in this picture, it's the ditch area where you've got this, looks like reed canary grass growing along the edge. And there you'd have to lean over the fence to try and look into that area to go with it. This is where sometimes using a stick is going to give you that advantage without getting your clothes caught on the barbed wire too much. But there's no point looking across on the field because the vegetation's completely wrong. If you have got these reed canary grasses and some of the sedges, then you can see how close together it is. A lot of the vegetation here has actually fallen over due to snow a couple of weeks beforehand, but in this small area, we normally find about 10 nests without too much difficulty because it's the right habitat. You wouldn't waste your time with too many others. And again, here you can see how close the vegetation is here. And again, sorting through these sedges makes a big difference. You've got a little bit of vegetation up onto that slope, which is mostly going to the tussock grasses. And again, that's another good habitat that goes with it. And again, looking at areas of set aside, whether it be a wild bird mix or it be something like elephant grass, they provide ideally this close togetherness of leaves, and we've managed to find harvest mice in both of those. So when it comes down to trying to find out which site you want to go to, that can be the difficulty. You could just be driving around the place and want to stop. Now, one of the advantages that we've got is we have this interactive map where you can see on the map the different squares, and on those different squares that shows where we've already done some surveys, but you can then go into this one and you can find out which area it was. So on this one you can see it was Staffordshire. There were surveys done in 2001, 2002, 2000 and a few more within those ones. It shows effort, it shows how many nests were found and everything else about it. So that could be quite useful. I might come back to this in a while, but if someone could put that link, we'll put that link into the chat a bit later, and I might show you how that one works. But that is really quite useful. So therefore you can see where we haven't been as well, which is where you might want to look to go with it. But it might be a case of people say to us, well, where do I start? How do I find out where to go with these ones? And although we have regional coordinators who will do this, this is the basic one. We use maps. We try to look at maps and say, okay, is that area going to suitable harvest mice? Has it got that rank grass, that rough grass that's been in that hasn't been mown for 3 or 4 years? Have we got areas of reeds or reed canary grass? Can I get to it on a public footpath? Can I use a foot on the road and just look at it from that point? Do I need to actually go into the actual land itself, in which case you need to ask permission from the landowner? And you can get a lot of this from maps. Now, I'm just going to, you can look at both photographic maps on this one, so satellite maps, but you can also look at use the Google Maps and actually go sideways to try and have a better view of what those areas are like. And other things. So I'm just going to stop sharing at this point and move on to sharing a different picture. So this is Google Maps, and this is an area not too far from where I am at the moment. And just by zooming in on aerial maps, you can look at what the vegetation is roughly like. You can see where the trees are, you can see if anything's been mown, and you can look at this and say, well, that looks like it's fairly rough grass. That's obviously agriculture. That's Not sure what that is, but that doesn't look very good there. That might be something else. That's actually a quarry, I think, in this instance. And you can have a good look around. You can look at, this is the mere itself, and on the edge of the mere, as you go in, you can see that there's a possibility of reed beds along the edge here to look at what's actually there. So these would be good places, but for that you'd need access. Whereas if you go across to the road, and with the usual ones on our friend here, you get our little man in yellow and you stick him on the road. Must be about there, I think. And then you can move up and down the road here and you can actually look sideways and see what the fields are like, to see whether or not that's going to be any good for what you want to do. And that's obviously all fairly small. That's not doing very well within that. If I just turn this round, okay, I can work out where I am. If I go down the road a bit, you can sometimes see over the hedgerows here. That's arable, so that's not going to help us. That's all short grass, that's not going to help us. There's not enough vegetation on there, so let me just crank back down this road again. That's permanent grassland there, but it doesn't look like it's quite old enough. Whereas on this side, that again is pasture, but there are places, to go to this gateway, you might be able to look down the edges, and that's got fairly good hedgerow edge there with lots of tall grasses growing up, so that would be worthwhile a look. If we go elsewhere, unless jumping up to Scotland at the moment, and this is Loch Leven. And again, if I put my little friend on here, if I go to maps, I won't want to go to. Okay. So again, we can see here that there's some vegetation that might be suitable here, but it's a little bit on the low side. If you stood in there, it might come up to your knees, but not very much more. Around the gateway here, you've got slightly better. You can see that just here next to the telegraph pole, you've got much more stronger, taller grasses that are tussock grasses. So I did decide to stop here earlier in this season, and I found a harvest mouse nest right next to that fence post. But as you go down this road, you can then look across to the reserve itself, and you can see there's quite some good areas out here that'd be worthwhile looking at. This is all relatively short grass. If we head down the road a bit further, then still can't see it, but you can start to see some of the rougher grasses here. If I move on from this road a little bit, and you can see here there is some rough grass within this area, down here, too short on either side on these bits. But here you've got, this is reed canary grass just in here. So if I go up just about here, you can see that this area across this side is quite good. It's a lot of canary grass, a nice little bank of it. So I have to admit, whenever I'm passing, I do pop in there, but I haven't managed to find anything as yet. If we look at somewhere else, so we got so how do I turn this into? Don't need those. So this should be Charlotte Park, and this should be why won't it? Sorry, I'm being very slow today trying to work out how to get this back to pictures.
Derek, you looking for the satellite images?
Yeah.
On the left at the bottom where you see layers. Left.
I probably can't. This might not be showing the whole screen for me at the moment.
All right. It's in. So at the bottom of the screen, you've got all your pictures. On the far left of that, can you see layers?
I can't see that on this one at the moment. Imagery.
Keep going all the way left on the further. There you go. Just right of there. There's a little square that says layers on it.
Okay. I've got it.
There you go.
Hidden by you. So yeah, so this is Charlotte. So if we zoom in again, we can look here to see there's lots of parkland within here. That doesn't really help. There's a nice lake there, and therefore I quite like lakes and stuff like that. So if I put my little bloke down onto that road, then you've got some vegetation there that's coming up through the bramble, but it's nothing especially good. But as I zoom round, let's go down to there. Then you can see you're starting to get some quite nice stuff just here along the edge of the stream. You've got some rushes, you've got some reed canary grass again, and even on this side over here, you've got some rough grass that hasn't been used, especially going up this edge of here. So you've got some ideas of where you could actually go, but again, in order to cross the fence, you need to then ask permissions. Can I have it? Shouldn't be a problem because it looks like there's public footpaths walking along this section, so you should be able to get there. But they won't like the fact that you're going to go near that stream. They don't want you to get wet and everything else that goes with it. So that's where that one comes into play. I've got one more to show you. This Burton under Needwood. We should have the river along here somewhere. Here we go. So I stick that there. You should be able to see again on this side running next to the reservoir there. Then again, you've got good tall grasses to look at. Let me just turn this round a bit. That doesn't help. It's quite good along this edge of the reed side of the roadside itself. And again, looking down through this area, you can then just see that's what you've got there. And again, we found lots of harvest mice there, but it's just a question as you're driving along, you can see these. If you don't want to, you want to find a new area in a square that you haven't done, then look at your maps first to go on from there. And then what you do have, let me just is that you can actually, right, so let me just stop that one. Share again. Damn thing gets in the way. So if you go on to, you can get OS maps online, and here you've got, it means that you can then work out through OS map whether there's an actual footpath that you can follow in order to move through. And on this particular area, it's quite good. It does show you quite nicely how to go with the different footpaths that are here. So if I then go back to the Google Maps and stick in so this is where the footpath actually runs down. You can see that this field isn't grazed very often, but there is a hedgerow, there is a fence line that's down here that's got overgrown vegetation next to it. So that would be a fairly good place to have a survey along that section down there. And then the footpath comes down to the bottom, cuts through this field, which isn't going to help you very much. But as soon as it hits this rough grass on the far side, you're doing better. And then it goes down through these areas on the edge of the wood. And again, that's another area that you can look within that, because you've got some of this rougher grass that's being shown along here, some of the field margins that go with it. Right, stop sharing. So as far as this goes, when you're out and about, one of the things that you can look for is look for the harvest mice. You'll probably need a pair of gloves because you're going to be pushing your hands through vegetation. You don't want to get caught on bramble and stuff like that, which is where a stick might come into handy. You need good footwear because you might be going into quite wet areas to try and find some of those canary grasses or through some of the reeds. And you need to take measures that when you find a nest, you can then actually record how big it is and how far off the ground it is. So this is one of the nests that we're looking for. It's about the size of a tennis ball. It has shredded grass within it, and you can see that clearly within some of these sections that it's been split down, and that's a characteristic. And secondly, it's still attached to the stems. So if you grab below the nest and lift it up, it'll actually come away on those stems, turn it upside down, it doesn't fall out. If you've got similar nests to this that are loose, then depending on your area, that might well be dormice instead, making a winter hibernation nest or even a summer nest for that matter as well. So all these nests at different heights, different vegetation, you will find the nests at different areas. You can see this one's 17 inches off the ground, well, that's 43 centimeters off the ground, held round a little bit of blackthorn, but in amongst the reeds. You've got one in sedges there, which is there, that one's still got a hole in it, and the other ones have just been taking photographs looking at with people's hands and stuff in the way. But you can see that the vegetation is still green, it's still relatively new and still alive within the vegetation. So if we look at the different areas, this is reed canary grass. They're pointing out the nest, which is basically about 2/3 of the way up. They've just split the grasses apart, but the vegetation itself is probably about 1 meter high, 1.20 high, and the nest sits around that 70 centimeter mark. This is Phragmites. The Phragmites has fallen over. The nest is clearly seen in center of picture there. And again, once this vegetation is actually taller, it normally stands about 150, and the nest sits in about the 1 meter mark. This is sedges. Very careful when you work through these because you tend to cut your hands on it. But the nest, again, you can see the length of the leaves there. It's about halfway along that leaves, even though these are actually sort of fallen over. And again, this is sedges next to a pond. And here, the sedges aren't very tall. They only sit about sort of 60 centimeters tall when they're actually upright. And the nest is anything from about 40 centimeters, 50 centimeters from there, from the bottom of the from ground. And then you've got your tussock grasses. This is cotsfoot, this one. And the tussock grass, you tend to find them in the middle of the actual tussock itself, not on those long taller stalks. And this is where, again, height-wise, the vegetation might be about sort of 30, 40 centimeters to the top of the actual leaves. And the nest is about 20 centimeters from there. And it's quite well nestled into that area. Can find them in different areas that were, again, where you've got plenty of leaf coming close together. So this is black grass on a heath moor, and again, the nest was in the middle of that vegetation. It's not very tall. The nest was only about 10 centimeters off the ground, but the vegetation at tallest part is only about 30 centimeters anyway. And occasionally you will do get very small ones. You can see this is a small individual nest rather than it being anything else. And just occasionally you find the nests are really quite open. But again, the vegetation is still about that half to 3/4 the way up. If you can't see the one there, it's basically slightly off center, about 3/4 the way up the page. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but it sits about there. Not all nests that you find are going to be harvest mice. There are going to be other things. So on the far left, we have field vole nests. The two in the middle are dormice nests, which aren't attached to the vegetation. And the one on the right-hand side, again, is quite large. It could be a harvest mouse nest, but it's not typical of it. It's not the right shape and some of the stuff there. So it's probably a vole nest, again, of some description. That's there, depending on how high it is. Sometimes we do find vole nests quite high up in vegetation, especially where it's fallen over. The Mammal Society has got a quick ident to how to work out whether it's a nest or not, but the best thing is to take a photograph and send it in to us. I'm going to stop there and allow Ross to continue. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Super. All right. Which screen are we on? We're on this one. Can you see that? Is that sharing? No, it's not.
Not yet.
How about now?
Yep, just coming on now. You're
Yeah,
there.
I can see it.
Good. All right. So this is a slight departure actually from what we would normally do in one of these webinars, where I wanted to give you a bit of an idea about what happens behind the scenes once data is submitted, and kind of the slightly the bigger picture of the survey as well, away from just the kind of individual surveys that happen, but what we actually do with the data once it's been sent in. So first thing to say is we couldn't do this kind of work without the fantastic contributions of volunteers. Over the last few years, it's helped to build probably one of the biggest data sets, if not the biggest data set of British harvest mice, which is incredibly it's a huge achievement for especially such an elusive species. I mean, as you know, they're a small animal. They're secretive, they're cryptic, and they're really difficult to spot, without looking for nests, which makes them quite challenging to monitor using traditional methods of camera trapping and mammal spotting and all this kind of thing. So this is why a citizen science approach to this is so essential, and it's because we can cover such a large number of sites with such a large number of people that we can actually produce data sets like the one that we have. Ultimately, and that leads to conservation actions and efforts to protect this species and indeed its habitats as well. So I'll just walk you through a few things about how why collecting this data is so important, and then what happens once it enters the database, as it were. So that I mentioned already, the harvest mice are notoriously difficult to find individuals. Derek mentioned it too. I mean, Derek goes out on harvest mice surveys for, it seems like almost every day. It probably isn't. He'll tell me off. And yet has only seen a couple of them outside of traps. And that's exactly why this project depends so heavily on volunteers. Even though nests are small and well hidden and located in dense vegetation, it means that we wouldn't be able to find them without people going out to sites and actually looking for them. So when you collect data, and this is through either finding them or not finding them as well, you're really helping to map where what kinds of habitats that harvest mice prefer. You'll be able to kind of, from this kind of data, we can understand where populations might be struggling or where indeed they might be doing really well. And this kind of thing is really critical to understanding, where we need to focus our conservation actions with this species. In fact, so far over the last few years, we've covered about 20% of all UK hectads. So I think Derek might have mentioned this earlier on, but just in case anyone doesn't know, the hectad is the 10 by 10 kilometre square, which covers the entire UK as part of the British National Grid. So essentially, we've covered a fifth of the UK land area at this point, and this is a huge step forwards in terms of understanding the harvest mouse national distribution. But of course, it's not 100%, so it means that there's still plenty more work to be done. And in fact, I would say, possibly even that the harvest mouse remains somewhat undersurveyed, because we really started from very few records of it. But what's most exciting is that this data isn't really just sitting in a database. It's not just static, but it's actively shaping conservation plans in the UK for this species. So by combining all of the data that gets submitted by all the volunteers, we can really highlight the key areas where we need to protect or restore habitat, and also highlight further research as well. And ultimately, this means that individual volunteers are contributing to a kind of national level understanding of how this species works and what we can do for it. So I just wanted to touch quickly on the importance of non-detections, because this is kind of an area where I think people tend to get a little bit people lose enthusiasm sometimes when they don't find anything. So on this map, you'll notice that this is a similar map to the one that Derek showed, the interactive one. You'll notice that there are two key types of survey outcomes on it. We've got positive surveys where we've got these green squares, and we've got non-detections where we have black squares which are hashed. And this distinction is really important because non-detection surveys really provide quite a lot of insight that detections alone can't by themselves. So when we map these two together, it can really help us identify areas where harvest mice might be absent or where populations are potentially limited by environmental factors. For example, where we have a cluster here, as shown on screen, a cluster of black hashed squares. This could indicate quite a large swathe of unsuitable habitat, such as all of the kind of arable short grassland that Derek was showing us on the Google Maps. Where am I? What I'm saying is, and also I think the other thing that's important to see here is that this black hashed area can cut suitable habitat, shown in green, away from each other, where we kind of, you know, these sorts of areas can indicate where habitats aren't necessarily connected very well, which means the animals can't move across them in order to populate areas further afield either. And these kinds of things can show kind of a boundary to the species range, where really we would like to avoid having any boundaries, you know, at all. So you know, this is the kind of thing which can indicate where you know, a road is built without doing proper, or well, I say this, a road might be built without regard for you know, wildlife, and so you know, causes populations to decline, because it means that they can't link up with each other. I think the other thing that's important to say about non-detections is that they're critical for identifying where the species are not. And it's that sounds like a simple thing. It's quite an obvious thing, but if we know where the species don't occur, then we have an idea of kind of fine level habitat characteristics that are causing them not to occur. So we can compare the two kind of areas where they are and where they're not, and we can kind of get a better understanding of exactly the conditions that this species makes use of, so that we can bring those conditions to areas which don't have them, and help to restore that area to become suitable for harvest mice in the future. So all of this to say, really, final point actually on this, second to final, in order for us to, we might say that it's kind of impossible, really. I mean, we've covered 20% of UK hectads in the last three years or so. That means, you know, if we hit our kind of we've you know, got a grand plan of 5 years, but we may continue on after this. It's unlikely that we'll be able to cover every single square inch of the country in that time. So a lot of the time, what we would start doing is using computer models, essentially, to figure out, you know, where species could be based on the characteristics that we've identified, you know, where their normal habitat is. And the only way to really do that effectively is to again know where they're not, which means that you know, to inform kind of modeling, which is sort of essential, as an essential next step for us after this, after the surveys happen, we need to know exactly where they're not as well as where they are. So finally, on this point, we get a lot of people saying they went out and looked for nests and they didn't find any, and then they don't continue doing surveys as well anymore after that, because it is quite discouraging when you're going out to look for a certain species and you don't find it, especially for the type of people who are going out to look for harvest mice nests in the first place. You're obviously doing it because you're interested in the wildlife and you'd like to see them. But I just think it's very important to remember that even if you don't find anything, telling us about it still contributes to this national effort that we're trying to lead, you know, to put forwards, and it's very, very worth doing. So the point is don't feel discouraged if you don't find anything. But let's say, changing tack here, that you do find a harvest mouse nests and you have some data to submit. So this data begins upon that submission on a bit of a journey, and it ensures that it can be used effectively for conservation. So on the screen at the moment are just a few of the steps that happen after a record is submitted. So typically volunteers will submit either a CSV file, which is just a kind of normal spreadsheet on Excel, or they might be using the our Mammal Society app, which is called Mammal Mapper. It's typically those two methods that we receive data. Mammal Mapper is actually an incredibly convenient way of recording observations, although some people prefer to, I suppose, have the feeling of a clipboard and pen in their hand as they're out in the field. But regardless, of the way that the data are sent in, they are all handled in the same way. And the first step is getting them into our central database, which is on a platform called Choreo, although that doesn't really matter, I suppose. So once it's in our database, stored there, it undergoes a kind of a bit of a verification process. All this means is that we kind of check over the data to make sure that there's nothing there that we wouldn't expect to find necessarily. Not that, if we find a harvest mouse in an area we wouldn't expect, because occasionally that does happen. But more so, is it that a transect is 150 kilometers long and someone's accidentally just left their phone recording the GPS data or something like that while they're using the app? That kind of thing will be taken out. We'll clean up a bit and make sure that all the comments look right and all of this kind of thing to make sure that the data are as accurate as we could possibly have them. And this kind of a process is really essential, I think, because as you can imagine, we receive data from all kinds of people, wide backgrounds, all volunteers, who all have a different level of experience. And sometimes we need to just make sure that the data are precise. And it means that when we come to report on those data, we can be confident that the conclusions that we're coming to are accurate. And all of this kind of helps us avoid propagating errors through our process, so we can finally end up with something that's sound. So once everything's verified, well, a couple of processes. One is data are sent to a platform called iRecord, which where they are further verified. The verification I do in-house is sort of separate from the verification that happens in iRecord. The iRecord verifiers will look at each record and say, is this a plausible record of this species? Yes or no, or how plausible it is. Derek knows much more about this, so if anyone has any questions on the exact process, pop it in the Q&A, and I'm sure Derek will get to it. And then once verified in iRecord, it gets sent on to what's called the NBN, which is the National Biodiversity Network, who have it's a hub really of all UK biodiversity records, and it's open source and it's free for scientists or conservationists or indeed anyone from the public to access and use for research, which is a hugely valuable resource for these kinds of things. And it means that records that are submitted as part of our projects aren't necessarily only used by us, but they may well go on to be used in the future by people who, at this point may not even have thought of their project. So it's just a symbol that it's not just our project that we're contributing to. It's a universal understanding of the species that we're recording. Yes. So on that note, contribution to a national data set, I just wanted to give you kind of a more of a, this is the same map that Derek showed actually. This is kind of an overview of all of the records that we have as part of the Mammal Society's National Harvest Mouse Survey. So you can see the detections on here, and you can also see the non-detections. And this is kind of what our current understanding of the harvest mouse population of the UK at this point. And it looks, obviously there are some gaps, but at this point, we are starting to build quite a comprehensive view of how harvest mice are doing in the UK. We've also got quite a good view of where they might be struggling in the UK. Again, that's where the non-detections come in. Most importantly from this map, and this was mentioned earlier on, we can see exactly where there has been low survey effort. So, in areas like, well, quite a lot of inland Wales and also the north of England and Scotland and Northern Ireland, there really haven't been many surveys at all. So this is another signal that, really we have some gaps to fill still, and it's not, even though we're in our 4th year, it's not late. It's not too late to get involved, because we still have quite a long way to go to get a a better picture of things. And it kind of goes a little bit along with what Derek was talking about. This kind of a map highlights areas where people who are interested in getting into surveying for this species can go. So I put the link in the Zoom chat here for that interactive one. I would invite anyone who's interested to go ahead and have a look at that. You can zoom into your local area, and you can see exactly where there hasn't been a survey before, and where you might be able to fill a gap, which would be fantastic. But this does highlight that we've made some incredible progress so far. Still plenty more to do. So we really do need as much help as we can get. And if anyone watching gets out there, your participation will be essential as we continue forwards. So I just wanted to emphasize finally how important the like a large effort is in this. Firstly, it allows us to resurvey sites that have already been surveyed in previous years, which means that we can track how well a kind of a local population of harvest mice is doing over time. It means that we can expand our geographical coverage by surveying new areas where we have little or no data. In fact, even a survey if you did one survey in the center of Wales, we would have just that would be incredibly valuable, because we'd be able to see kind of, we'd get an idea of where the line is, that the boundary of the species range, I suppose. And I think finally, even if you're not kind of, you might not be able to make it out to field sites or do physical surveys yourself, just spreading the word about this to family or friends, colleagues, in fact, would help us to expand our network of volunteers. And with more people involved, obviously more surveys happen, and we get a better picture of how things are going. So yes, we're on our way. We've already got probably one of the most comprehensive data sets for the species in the country. We've still got plenty more to do, and there's lots of ways to get involved, either by doing field surveys or just by kind of spreading the word about the species and encouraging others to do so. Okay, so that's all I've got. I've got a question slide. The QR code on here just takes you to the web page on our website for the survey. But that's all. I've gone over time. Apologies. I'll leave this up just in case anyone's trying to whip their phone out to scan that QR code for a moment.
Thank you so much, Ross and Derek. It was really brilliant. And yeah, if you have any question, feel free to put it in the Q&A section. I've seen a couple of people with their hands raised, but because of the structure of this webinar, it's not possible to unmute yourself. So if you can put the questions in the chat. Okay, so one quick question is about the survey period. So does either of you want to answer that?
Yeah, certainly. We normally start in late October and go through to about March. The reason for this is that they can still be breeding in late October or early October, and we don't want to actually disturb nests with young in it. And we suggest that we finish in April, because they'll be starting to think about starting breeding again from the winter period. Although it's possible to find nests in the summer, we try not to because of the disturbance factor.
Right. And a few more questions coming in. So someone says, I live in South Wales and I'm interested in how I can help increase the records for Wales. Keen to know if there are any key areas you'd advise to collect data for.
Yeah, I think the starting point for that is take a look at in fact, I think it might still be there. Have a look at the map that we've got. I'm not familiar with the area, so I can't provide any kind of names of places. But if you think that you can get to a place that doesn't have either a green square or a black hashed square, and conduct a survey in that kind of an area, that would be fantastic. There are also, I would say, mammal groups across the country who will contribute to this. And there is one in, well, there's the Pembrokeshire Mammal Group, which I'm not sure if they'd be close enough by, but worth looking up. I mean, you can look up something like, local mammal group in my area, that kind of thing. And if you contact people like that, they'll be able to kind of get you involved. They might have surveys that they've already lined up that you can be that you can attend as your first go.
And I think also it's important that we have resources on the Mammal Society webpage that shows you how to survey. It shows you nests of different species and what it looks like. So you could look at that and help yourself as well. And again, any nests that you find that you're uncertain of, just take photographs and send them either to Ross at his address or mine, which is Atlas at the Mammal Society. Then we'll tell you what we think within that. But if you can use the Mammal Mapper app, it helps because the pictures can automatically come across onto that, and then Ross can share them as needed.
It's great. I think we answered the questions in the chat, but just to confirm, so someone asked how long you should survey for. And as far as I'm aware, there isn't really a time frame for surveying. In sessions I took part in, it was about 2 to 3 hours, but yeah, you can do it for as long or as little as you feel comfortable to.
Derek's got quite a fun one.
Okay.
Well, it's one of these silly ones. I mean, to say on one of the surveys that showed you up in Knockleven, I started a survey and my survey lasted a minute because I found one straight away. And I was only looking for present absence. But if it can be, I can drive along, I can see a likely habitat, I can jump out, I look for 5-10 minutes, I find a nest, and I think, right, that's another tick, and I can go away again. Or it could be that it takes me half an hour to find one. If I'm looking for more than an hour, it gets very demoralizing if I haven't found one. So it does depend on how big the area is, how much time you've got. But generally, most of our local mammal groups that go out do this with a team, and therefore it becomes a little bit of a competition as who's going to find the first one. So it's just a case of look at your area, how easy is it going to be, and how do you move forward from that. But if anyone needs any more advice over after this, and they want more advice, then please just ring one of us up or email one of us, and we'll give you as much help as we can.
Okay, should we wait a couple more minutes to see if anybody else has any more question?
There was a couple of other questions that were in the chat which I answered directly because I didn't know how much time we had left. And that was, how do you know if it's a harvest mouse nest or a dormouse nest? And basically, it's all about, they're both woven nests, they're both about the same sort of size, but a harvest mouse nest is attached to the vegetation. So if you grab that vegetation and hold it upside down, it doesn't fall out. Whereas dormice, although they do create a very similar nest with split leaves and everything else, it'll fall out the vegetation because it's not attached, it's merely just sitting there. The other thing while we're just waiting is that, again, if you looked at Ross's map, it showed that we had quite a lot of negative sites in Scotland, but we also had some positives. So that's just down to this survey of us looking that they're there. And to show that they are there, the furthest north we've been is the north coast of Scotland, where we have one harvest mouse record. And we haven't been able to replicate that on a subsequent visit, but we've got a record up there, so they should be all the way across. It's just a case of people aren't looking. We need to get out there and look.